So, welcome back to Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, and today we're going to be taking a look at the troop tree of the Battanians, which of course have their real life roots firmly established in the Celtic culture, and the Pictish one as well, so Scotland, Ireland, Wales, the Gauls, but also they have a few other things going for them as well, like the overuse perhaps of the Falks in their infantry lineup, which is a Dacian weapon, so they definitely have a bit of a spread, definitely one of the factions which casts a wider net perhaps when it comes to their real life inspirations. Overall, they have perhaps the most clearly defined weaknesses of all the factions in the game as well, being that their cavalry lineup is very limited in comparison to the other factions. They are still capable of fielding it at the very least, unlike the Nords from Warband, but it is most certainly on the lower end of their priorities. And also overall they are the most fragile faction as well, with many of their units boasting lighter armour values, shall we say, than all of their neighbours. But they of course make up for this by having the ability to do extreme amounts of damage at range and up close and personal, and that will become immediately apparent when we have a look at their troop tree in greater detail. So the Battanians, I would suggest, are very much a high-risk, high-reward kind of faction. They definitely favour sort of more ambush tactics, sort of setting up your formations perfectly with your ranged units to do a lot of damage quickly, and when you do commit to melee, you want the fight to be over with as fast as possible, because of course you don't have the staying power as really any other faction in the game. Even the Sturgians, who are also a little bit lightweight in terms of their defensive values, in a lot of cases are significantly tougher in the long run than a faction like the Battanians, but you could certainly argue that the damage the Battanians can deal across their whole roster is more than worth the additional fragilities that they also incur. Battanian volunteers, of course, again, tier 1 units. There's really not much to say about the tier 1 units once again. Very similar to many of the others. You can see they have that club that they wield as well as their primary weapon, so they bear a little bit more in common perhaps with the Imperial recruits and the Khuzait nomads, more so than the polearm wielding recruits from the Vlandians and the Aserai. But overall it's obviously it's very limited in the differences that's ultimately going to make. But you do have a decision to make pretty early here. The first is, do you want your units to be a little bit more defensive in nature, or do you want to immediately go into the more aggressive ones? Now I'd say that to start with we're going to go down the left hand tree, which is the more defensive ones, and you do still need to build up a core as Battania. You can't, well, you can in the late game, to be fair, have entirely damage dealing units, but certainly on your way up it's probably not going to behoove you to go down the fragile route right away. The Battanian Clan Warrior, which is pretty much your typical tier 2 sort of up close and personal unit, obviously they add having a polearm to their repertoire as well as having slightly better armour, which of course is in fairly short supply among Battania. You know, if you compare units of any tier of Battania really against their rivals from other factions, armour is going to be one area where they do slightly lag behind. They do have tougher units, which we will get onto momentarily, but even so, I mean, the Battanian Clan Warrior, to be fair, is a tier 2 unit. The differences aren't going to be that big. In fact, compared to stuff like the Khuzait or even the Aserai, a unit like this may even be superior, to be fair. But obviously it's really when you get up to the higher levels that you want your units to have their power spikes. Speaking of which, tier 3, the first unit that's going to be equipped with a shield for the Battanians. Their equipment is just that little bit better as well. You can see that they add some shoulder armour, so they're going to be a little bit tougher. The helm is also a little bit better. And just in general, as far as the tier 3 unit of infantry goes, I mean, they certainly won't steer you far wrong. Obviously they come armed with a basic one-handed weapon. They also have that spear on their back as well as a shield. The armour is going to be slightly less than something along the lines of the Vlandian infantry or the Imperial trained infantry. But the trained warrior will still do a very good job at holding, and they will buy time, of course, for some of your flare units to do their work. And then you have a choice to make. Do you go down what is primarily the Battanians' only real cavalry option when it comes to the shock that most other factions can take for granted, or do you want to continue down the line infantry path? So we're going to continue down the line infantry path here, because obviously that's going to be an important part of any initial army build, I think, because the shield is going to be very good for preserving the lives of your men, making them just that little bit tougher against any opponent. And the Battanian picked warrior is what we can see here, and you can see immediately they start to add in the chainmail, which obviously will make them significantly tougher. The shoulder armour is just a little bit better. You can see the tartan, the green tartan, or plaid, I should say, that they also have. Overall, they're just a better version of the trained warrior. Again, better equipment, better at using it, and they're decent, to be fair. I mean, this is It's important to note that while the Battanians overall are going to be more fragile than pretty much any other faction in the game, that is mostly because of the units they will generally want to spec into are the more fragile variants. This line infantry path is not all that much more fragile than offering some other factions, to be fair to them. And finally, we have the Battanian trained spearmen, so the last in the line. Obviously with the name Spears, they're obviously going to be a little bit more focused around pulling out their spears if they can, but they still have the one-handed sidearm, the sword that they have. So perhaps against other armoured troops they're not going to be as good as something that wields a mace along the lines of the Vlandian sergeants. But spears, one-handed weapon, the shield they wield is also fairly sizable as well, the sort of big oval shields that they have. And you can just see from looking at them, their equipment is pretty damn good, so they're going to be able to do a very good job as line infantry. Whether you have enough of them to be able to go toe-to-toe with some of the more heavy-duty factions in the game remains to be seen, but a big part of that is going to come down to the support you're able to put in place on the front line as well. But you also have the option for cavalry, and while the Battanians are the least cavalry-focused faction in the game, having a bit of mobility is still going to be quite important, especially perhaps for more defensive purposes, to defend some of your more fragile skirmishers, which we'll get onto a little bit later on. Battanian Scouts as a tier 4 unit of cavalry, so you can see, while they do have the name Scout, which conjures up names of perhaps light cavalry, that is perhaps a little bit unfair on them, because you can see, the armour they wear is pretty thick. Their horses, though, are not going to be as well armoured either as some other offerings from other factions, so the steppe barding, the sort of heavy lamella style horse barding that the Imperials and the Aserai have, and obviously the big chain coats that the horses wear as well for Vlandia. The Battanian horses are going to be more fragile, as are their riders, to be fair, but again, I do feel as though the differences in survivability from the Battanians to the rest of the factions in the game is not as wide as you might expect it to be, considering the general feel of the factions, and these guys will do a perfectly salvageable job, or serviceable I should say, not salvageable, but they do salvage the Cavalry, to be fair, for Battania. And they do decent shock damage. The Battanian Horseman is pretty much the furthering of that. You can see that the horse armour on this unit is actually better. So while most other factions will get their horse armour, sort of their highest tier horse armour at tier 4, the Battanians do have to wait till tier 5, which is something to bear in mind. But yeah, other than that, they're perfectly capable as shock cavalry for the Battanians. Going toe-to-toe with pretty much any other faction in the game, though, if they have the numbers behind them, is probably not going to be a good idea. It is going to be worthwhile to keep an eye on your horsemen a little bit more and to keep them perhaps on a little bit of a tighter leash, and to try and engage in much more hit-and-run tactics, which controlling cavalry like that from a battlefield position can be a little bit tricky, which is, again, feeds into the reason why the Battanians, maybe their horsemen are not going to be quite as strong as other factions' offerings, but, perfectly good unit. Back to tier 1 now, and now you have the other choice, which this is the other unit path you can take. Effectively is going to be the unit path of more fragile units, but this is going to be where a lot of your damage can be dealt on foot, starting with the Battanian Woodrunner, which is the entry-level Javelin unit for the Battanians. Javelins make up a huge proportion of the mainline Battanian skirmish. In fact, pretty much, yeah, all of it, in fact. The only arch unit they have is their noble unit, which we'll get onto later, which is incredibly powerful. But from your standard Battanian volunteers, you're only going to have access to javelins when it comes to range damage. Now, that's perfectly fine, of course, because javelins, especially if you have enough ammunition, can do tons and tons of damage, but it does mean you're going to have to get in range first of all. So if the enemy have a lot of archers in particular, the Woodrunners are really going to struggle with that. They're going to take a lot of damage. Then you have a choice to make. Do you want to continue down the Javelinman path, or do you want to make them more of a shock infantry unit with javelins as an accompaniment? So we're going to go down the shock infantry path first of all. The Battanian Raider, which of course you can see, they have the long weapon on the back. They still have their sidearm. Overall, I would say that it's really up to tier 4 and 5 where the Battanian shock infantry really starts to earn its stripes, because then they start to be really, really damaging because of the weaponry they use. But the Battanian Raider is just the first step on that particular journey. Tier 4, the Battanian Falksman. Now you can see immediately the armour is questionable. They wear no body armour, in fact. It's only really the shoulder armour that gives them any sort of survivability there. However, the Falx in close quarters is a really devastating weapon, and very effective against armoured targets. If you can get into a If you can get your Falksmen around the side of a line battle, for example, against something like Imperial Legionaries or Vlandian Sergeants, some of the beefier line infantry units in the game, the kills will rack up very, very quickly on the Falksmen. However, having said that, as with any shock infantry unit in the game, using them is somewhat tricky. Using them to their full effectiveness is somewhat tricky, because if you send them in with the main body of your infantry, they're going to get shot up by arrows. In a messy fight on the front line, the lack of a shield really hurts their survivability. So you do need to be a little bit careful. There's no doubting the fact they can be incredibly damaging in a siege as well, but they do require a little bit more looking after. And that, of course, applies also to the veteran Falksman, which, of course, just has better equipment all around. Better armour as well, to be fair to them. They're a little bit tankier, which is to their credit. But still, in comparison to most other shock infantry in the game at tier 5, they're going to be a little bit more on the lightweight side, in spite of the fact they are capable of dealing lots and lots of damage, as well as having access to projectiles as well. They're not actually the most squishy tier 5 shock infantry unit. That actually does go to the Sturgians, but we'll get onto that next time. For here though, just know that obviously the Battanians are all about their ability to deal damage quickly, so it follows of course that their shock infantry are going to be effective if they are used correctly. Part of dealing damage though is at range, and that's perhaps where the Battanians are most at home, and their Javelin men do feed pretty heavily into that. The Battanian Skirmisher, which is capable of looking after itself in melee as well, with the they have a spear, they have a shield, capable of throwing their projectiles as well. All around a pretty good all-round soldier. They're not going to have the same level of rigidity as the line infantry line, but the fact that they are capable of looking after themselves in melee as well as having a plentiful supply of projectiles is nice. But don't rely on them to hold the line against professional infantry from other factions, because they will crumble if they aren't given space to use their javelins. Moving on up to tier 4, you can see a lot of javelins on these lads here. The veteran skirmisher actually has armour which is comparable to the picked warrior as well, but once again more of a ranged focus on them. So it does pay, I think, to mix and match these units, but you can get away with having more of a proportion of veteran skirmishers and more javelin men than you might from other factions, just because they are a little bit more multifaceted with Battania, which is useful because I think they do very much need that. They need to have a lot of javelins at their disposal to help thin out the enemy ranks in melee. And then you have the final choice that you can make with the standard Battanian infantry line. Do you want to max out on foot javelins, or do you want to have a mounted javelin cavalry unit? The foot javelins, the Battanian wildling, a very effective unit all around, I must say. One of the gems of the Battanian roster, as I've noted, because their javelins are very effective. They're harpoon-like javelins. They have a very large shield, the sort that you would normally associate with the high-tier Sturgian infantry. And also they're perfectly capable of defending themselves in melee. Obviously they have a spear that they use in melee, which isn't the most damaging, but at the very least it does mean they're capable of protecting themselves from cavalry in melee, as well as at range with those devastating javelins they have. And I feel as though this is a pretty safe bet if you want to go down the skirmish route, as a sort of safe bet to have as your most numerous unit on your, as far as your foot troopers go, because the javelins are simply too good not to bring, I think. And yeah, it is important for the Battanians to make as much use as possible of the damage they're capable of dealing. And normally I would be a proponent of going down a line infantry path to pad out your army, and the trained spearmen are certainly a very good one. And while the wildling is maybe not as tough in melee as the trained spearmen, I do think the damage they can deal with those javelins is more than enough to make up for it. However, you do have a little bit more mobility as well from a cavalry perspective. If you want to have a bit of ranged cavalry, you do have the Battanian mounted skirmisher. Have to say, you know, they are very capable of dealing similar amounts of damage. Obviously they have the same javelins as the Battanian wildling. I would caution with this unit though, you do need to make sure that they are capable of, generally speaking, the ranged cavalry AI is good, so you're able to sort of leave them to do their own thing, a little bit more so than the lance cavalry. Having said that, if you're going up against a faction that has access to a lot of horse archers, and has got a lot of horse archers, the Khuzait are an obvious one. The Battanians and the Khuzait don't start near one another, but they are two factions which do tend to do quite well in the hands of the AI, so you may very well be meeting one another sooner than you might expect after the Empire's out of the way. If you're up against horse archers, they will not obviously be very good because they can be kited to death pretty quickly. The fire rate is obviously in question as well. Up against a more static army, however, especially if you're going to try and focus down heavy cavalry, A faction like the Vlandians could struggle if you have a big horde of mounted skirmishers, because you can just kite their heavy cavalry all over the field, javelin them down, and then start going to town with your overall weaker lance cavalry, but by that point you should be far more numerous. So, I mean, the Battanians, definitely a focus around their ability to deal damage here, but perhaps their most outstanding troop, I would definitely say, would be their noble trooper, and we'll move on to that one right now. So the Battanians have got a focus around skirmishing with javelins in their main line. However, their noble troop line is very unique in the fact that it is entirely unmounted units. They are all on foot. Other factions do have some of their initial noble line be on foot, for example the Imperials and the Sturgians as well, up to level 3. However, the Battanians have their entire noble troop tree stay on foot, which again just feeds into the fact they're not overly cavalry focused. Every other faction has got some really high-end unit of cavalry which they can use as their sort of their showpiece unit. For the Battanians, it is archers, and they wield a two-handed sword and a longbow all throughout their roster. It's a very linear progression, again, as you would expect. Very, very effective overall. I mean, the longbows they have a reputation, and they definitely live up to that reputation in this game with the Battanians, because if you can get enough of this troop line, it can be utterly devastating at the high end. Even here at the low end, though, like, you do need to get as many of them as possible. If you're going for a fully Battanian-themed army, you do need to shop around and get as many highborn youths as you possibly can, because, of course, it's your only archer option if you're doing that, which can be a little bit of a problem, because it means early on you may be finding yourself outnumbered at range, which can be a real killer. And it does take you a little while perhaps to build up to that feared Battanian skirmish line, which I'm sure many people have probably seen the footage of 200 or so Fians just going to town. Moving up to the Highborn Warrior, the progression is fairly simple. You can see very early on, actually, with the Highborn Warrior, their armour increases. I mean, most noble units like this, I would say it's from tier 4 onwards where you start to see a noticeable uptick in quality. The Battanians, perhaps again, somewhat fortunately for them, it's tier 3 onwards, because again the chain, which most other Battanian units have to wait till tier 4 to get, once again the two-handed weapon means they're perfectly capable of looking after themselves in melee, but the main event is going to be those longbows and how effective they can be with them. Very accurate, very damaging, and of course fast firing, unlike the crossbows. Battanian Hero, you can see once again the armour increases. This is the sort of armour which tier 5 units were wearing in their standard troop line. Once again, two-handed sword, longbow, decent armour by Battanian standards with the chain and the nice helm as well. Again, the longbow is the star of the show here. And then we get into the Battanian Fians. So from tier 5 and tier 6 with this unit, if you can build up enough Fians, you are going to be able to really do tons and tons of damage before the enemy ever gets in range of you. Getting enough of them is a problem. I mean, you can say with pretty much any of the noble troop lines, if you can get enough of them, then you're going to be really, really dominant. But it's especially apparent, I think, with the Fians. So you can see there that is a Falx they have on their back, which means they're very damaging against most units as well, because the Falx is a very effective weapon in this game against all troop types, whether they're lightly armoured, heavily armoured, doesn't really matter. Very capable of dealing damage in a cleaving fashion. But still, the longbows are the star of the show. And then you have the Fian champions, which, in terms of their ability to deal damage at range, they are the most spectacular unit in the game. I'm a big fan of the Khan's Guard, but their main thing is the fact they're able to do that whilst being mobile. In terms of pure damage output, the Fian champions are going to be better than anything else you can get. The best armour that the Battanians can have, really, really solid at range as well. Very, very good. Just all around, like, this, I think, is reason enough alone to choose the Battanians as your faction. If you can get up to even just 50 or so Fian champions, your army is going to be a truly devastating force. But of course, most people are really aiming for that several hundred longbowman, Agincourt style, staring down the barrel of a heavy cavalry line and destroying it before it ever gets close to you. That is the dream as the Battanians, but getting there can be somewhat tricky, because levelling up their more fragile troops can be a rockier road than some of the tankier factions, for example. But there's no doubting the effectiveness of the mighty longbow. So the Battanians overall, for me, I do prefer having a more solid lineup of initial troops. But the Battanians are They're solid enough if you level up their initial troops to be maybe a little bit more defensive in nature, and then later on spec into some of the more damaging stuff, like up close with the Javelin men with the Falcons, and then obviously having the Fian as a centerpiece. And it could also be why the Battanians tend to do quite well in the hands of the AI, because they do have the ability to deal damage even against armoured targets quite easily, which means the Vlandians, the Empire, and even the Sturgians to an extent can struggle to face off against the Fians effectively, or well, the Battanians overall effectively. Anyone would struggle against the Fians, I think. A good faction, I think. I mean, it certainly requires a certain play style. It's going to be one of those things where I think if it suits your play style, then nothing else will do. The Battanians will easily be your favourite faction by a long way. If it doesn't, however, then you probably won't really rate the Battanians all that highly if you want that more orthodox style of warfare, where you have your organised sort of infantry and heavy cavalry and sort of backing them up with support. Then you might want to look elsewhere, because the Battanians are definitely more about hit and run, doing damage in different ways, but if you take a straight up fight with them, then they're probably going to lose, unless their damage is enough to dig them out, but they're still going to take heavy losses from that. So yeah, that was a look at the Battanian troop tree. Again, didn't go into stats too much, because again, it's pretty much confirmed, I think, at this point that they don't actually do anything at this point in time, and it's one of those things where it's not really worth paying too much attention to at this stage. But overall, I mean, the spread of stats is still going to be, so like nearly 300 on bow there would be the intention for the Fian champion. So next will be the final Bannerlord 2 faction troop tree to have a look at, and we will be ending on probably the strangest troop tree, actually. Definitely the one with, I think, well, we'll go through it when we get there, but the Sturgians are in a rather interesting position, and not interesting in a particularly good way either. They definitely have their good points, but for the most part I think the Sturgians are the ones most in need of a boost. So yeah, I hope you found this somewhat informative, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.